We picture our ancestors as mighty hunters, spears raised, faces set, charging across the open plains after a mammoth or a herd of wild horses, bringing down enough meat to feed the whole tribe in one glorious, bloody triumph. It's the image on every documentary, every museum, mural, every cave painting tribute. The noble human hunter, master of the animal world. And it's not entirely wrong. But it is, in a very important way, deeply misleading. Because here's what that heroic image leaves out. The hunt failed. Constantly. Animals are fast and clever and unpredictable. The herds moved on. The seasons turned. The winters came, and the prey grew scarce or vanished entirely. For our ancestors, the thrilling, successful hunt was the exception, not the rule. And the truly defining challenge of human survival was never the day you brought home the mammoth. It was all the days you didn't. So here's the real question. The one this whole video is about. What did our ancestors eat when the hunting failed? When the herds were gone, the easy prey had scattered, and there was seemingly nothing left to kill? Because that situation wasn't a rare disaster. It was a regular, recurring feature of human life. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The answer to that question, the humble, unglamorous, overlooked answer, is the actual reason our species is still here at all. This isn't a story about the hunt. This is a story about the gaps between the hunts, the lean times, the hungry times, and the astonishing ingenuity humans developed to survive them. Let's start by correcting the record, because the myth of the mighty hunter has truly warped how we see the past. For a long time, the popular image of prehistoric life was almost entirely about meat. Man the hunter, defined by the chase and the kill. But as scientists looked closer, studying the bones, the teeth, the tools, and the surviving hunter-gatherer societies of more recent times, a very different and much more complicated picture emerged. The truth is that human diets varied enormously depending on where people lived. In the frozen Arctic, where almost nothing grows, people really did live overwhelmingly on animals, fish, and fat because they had no other choice. But in warmer, greener parts of the world, the balance often tipped dramatically the other way. Many groups got a huge share of their calories, sometimes the majority, not from hunting at all, but from gathering, from plants, from roots, seeds, nuts, fruits, and tubers patiently collected day after day. And here's the crucial point about gathering. It's reliable. A hunt is a gamble. You might spend all day chasing prey and come back with nothing, but a patch of edible roots doesn't run away. A nut tree doesn't flee when it sees you coming. The plants are just there, waiting, predictable, dependable. And in a dangerous, uncertain world, reliable is everything. So while the hunt provided the dramatic feasts, it was very often the steady, unglamorous work of gathering that provided the foundation, the daily bread that kept people alive between the feasts. And notably, in many societies, this essential, life-sustaining work of gathering was done largely by women, whose quiet, expert labor fed the group far more consistently than the celebrated hunt ever did. And the evidence for this keeps getting stronger, sometimes from surprising places. Scientists have learned to study the hardened plaque on the teeth of ancient skeletons. And trapped inside it, they've found the microscopic remains of what people actually ate. The results have been eye-opening. Even Neanderthals, who we long imagined as the ultimate meat-eating brutes, turn out to have eaten a wide range of plants, grains, seeds they ground up with stone tools, cooked plant foods. The picture of the all-meat caveman simply does not survive contact with the actual evidence. Plants were on the menu, deep, deep into our past, even among our supposedly most carnivorous relatives. So already, the picture has shifted. The base of human survival in most of the world wasn't the spear. It was the digging stick and the gathering basket. But that's just the everyday reality. We still haven't gotten to the hard part. The truly desperate times, the famines, the deep winters when even the plants were gone, the roots were frozen in the ground, and the easy food had run out completely. What then? When there is genuinely almost nothing? This is where human survival becomes a story of pure, stubborn genius. And the first weapon in that fight was knowledge. Specifically, an absolutely staggering knowledge of the natural world that almost no modern human possesses. Our ancestors were walking encyclopedias of their environment. A skilled forager could look at a landscape that would seem utterly barren and empty to you or me, and see a pantry. They knew in intimate detail every single edible thing in their territory. Not just the obvious tasty foods, but the backups and the backups to the backups. They knew which roots could be dug up in the dead of winter, which barks and saps could be eaten, which seeds could be ground into flour, which plants were poisonous, and which of those poisonous plants could be made safe with the right preparation. This knowledge, accumulated and refined and passed down across countless generations, was their single greatest survival tool. It was a library of life and death, stored entirely in human memory. And think about how fragile that made it. There were no books to consult, no records to fall back on. If the elder who knew the location of the last reliable water in a drought died before passing it on, or the woman who knew exactly how long to leach a particular poisonous root took that knowledge to her grave, then a piece of the group's survival died with them. Every experienced forager was a living archive, and every death was, potentially, the burning of a small library that had taken a lifetime and generations before it to fill. And when the good food ran out, they turned to what we now call famine foods. These are the foods of last resort. The things nobody eats unless they have to, because they're tough or bitter or barely nutritious, or require enormous effort to make edible. But they're the difference between starving and surviving. And the famine foods our ancestors relied on are genuinely remarkable. Take tree bark. It sounds absurd, like the very definition of having nothing to eat. But the inner bark of certain trees, the soft layer called the cambium, just beneath the rough outer bark, is actually edible. It contains carbohydrates and nutrients, and it can be dried, ground into a powder, and mixed with other ingredients to make a kind of crude flour or bread. This wasn't just a desperate prehistoric trick either. In parts of Scandinavia, people made bark bread from tree cambium during hard times well into recorded history. In fact, some indigenous peoples of North America were known to certain neighbors, somewhat mockingly, as the eaters of trees, precisely because they would turn to tree bark to survive the harshest winters, when nothing else was left. When the animals are gone and the ground is frozen, the trees themselves become food. Then there are foods so toxic that eating them should kill you, but which our ancestors learned, through who knows how many deaths and discoveries, to render safe. The classic example is the acorn. Acorns are everywhere, oak trees grow, abundant and full of calories. But raw, they're loaded with bitter compounds called tannins that make them inedible and even harmful. So our ancestors figured out how to process them. They would crush the acorns and leach them, soaking or rinsing them repeatedly in water, sometimes for days, to wash the bitter toxins out until what remained was a safe, nutritious flour. Think about what that represents. The patience and the accumulated wisdom to take a poisonous nut and, through a multi-step process with no understanding of the underlying chemistry, transform it into a staple food. That is not the act of a primitive mind. That is sophisticated food technology, and bark and acorns were only the beginning. The famine pantry went much further. In the cold north, people ate lichen, the crusty growth you see clinging to rocks and trees, which is barely food at all, tough and nutrient poor, but which can be processed and boiled into something edible when there's nothing else. Interestingly, some peoples got their lichens secondhand by eating the partially digested stomach contents of reindeer and caribou, animals that can break down lichen far better than we can. When you're starving, even the half-digested meal inside another creature's belly becomes a resource. And then there were the small things, the creatures too humble to bother with in good times, but that became vital in bad ones: insects, grubs, larvae dug out of rotting wood, snails, worms, the eggs of insects. These are, pound for pound, often excellent sources of protein and fat, far easier to catch than a deer, and available when all the big game has vanished. To us, the idea of eating a handful of grubs is revolting. To a hungry human in a hard winter, it was a lifeline, a reliable little package of nutrition hiding under every rotting log. The squeamishness is a luxury of the well-fed. Here's a detail I find fascinating. Many of these famine foods, the odd plants people only turned to in desperation, were also their medicines. The very same plants that filled empty bellies in hard times were known to treat ailments and ease sickness. The line between food and medicine, so sharp in our world, barely existed in theirs. The desperate knowledge of what to eat when starving, and The healing knowledge of what to take when sick were branches of the same deep, hard-won understanding of the living world. And here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. We've been talking as if when the meat ran out, the animals were simply gone. But what about the animals they had already caught? What about the carcass itself? Because here, too, our ancestors wasted absolutely nothing. When you're facing starvation, an animal is not just its meat. It is a treasure chest of survival. And our ancestors learned to extract every last calorie from it. The most prized prize of all was fat, because in a lean, hungry world, fat is pure, dense, life-giving energy. And the richest source of hidden fat is inside the bones. So our ancestors would take the bones, even old ones, even ones already stripped of meat, smash them open, and boil them for hours to render out the precious bone grease and marrow floating to the surface, which could be skimmed off and eaten or stored. Nothing was left behind. The organs, the blood, the marrow, the fat, the connective tissue. Every part of an animal that we would throw away today was, to a hungry human, a vital source of survival. We see this same logic in many cultures. The careful, total rendering of every scrap of an animal into usable food and fat, leaving nothing but clean, cracked bone. And then there was the long game. Insurance against the lean times. Because the smartest way to survive a famine is to prepare for it before it arrives. Our ancestors became experts at preservation. They learned to dry meat and fish in the sun and wind, turning perishable food into something that would last for months. They learned to smoke it over fires, which both preserved it and added flavor. In cold climates, they used the freezing temperatures themselves as a natural larder, caching food in the ice and frozen ground. They stored nuts and dried plants. They rendered fat into forms that would keep. Some of these preserved foods were small miracles of survival engineering. Consider the kind of concentrated travel food that many cultures independently invented, a dense mix of rendered fat, pounded dried meat, and sometimes dried berries, all combined into a compact, energy-rich cake that could last for months, even years, without spoiling. It was nutritionally complete in a way few single foods are, packing protein and enormous amounts of fat-derived energy into a form light enough to carry and stable enough to store. A pouch of it could mean the difference between life and death, on a long journey or through a brutal winter. This was not crude survival eating. This was, in its own way, a sophisticated technology, a way of capturing a summer's abundance and locking it into a form that could be carried straight through the dead of winter. Every one of these techniques was a way of reaching through time, taking the abundance of a good day and sending it forward to feed them on a bad one. The successful hunt didn't just feed you tonight. Preserved and stored, it could help you survive the empty weeks to come. This foresight, this ability to plan against future hunger, was one of the most powerful survival tools humans ever developed. There's something deeper hiding in all of this too. Because if hunger was such a constant companion throughout our history, then it didn't just test our ancestors, it shaped them, right down to the body. Think about your own tendency to crave fatty, sugary, calorie-dense food, and to store any excess as fat around your body. In our modern world of endless abundance, we treat this as a problem, a flaw. But it isn't a flaw, it's an inheritance. It is the legacy of hundreds of thousands of years of feast and famine, a body exquisitely tuned by scarcity to grab calories whenever they appeared, and hoard them against the lean times that were always coming. Your craving for that rich, sweet food is the voice of every ancestor who survived a winter because their body knew how to store a good meal. We are, quite literally, built by hunger. And it may have shaped more than our bodies. It may have shaped our deepest social instincts. In a world where the hunt was a gamble and starvation was always near, the single best insurance policy a human could have was other humans. The group that shared, that pooled its food, that made sure the unlucky hunter still ate today. Because you might be the unlucky one tomorrow, was the group that survived. The relentless threat of hunger may be one of the very forces that forged our powerful instincts to share, to cooperate, to care for one another. Famine didn't just make us resourceful. It may have helped make us kind. So let's put together the full picture of what our ancestors actually did when the animals were gone. They leaned on the reliable foundation of gathered plants. They drew on an immense hard-won knowledge of every edible thing in their world. They turned to famine foods, the bark and the toxic nuts and the foods of last resort that they had the genius to make edible. They extracted every possible calorie from the animals they did have, down to the grease inside the bones. And they planned ahead, preserving and storing food, as insurance against the hunger they knew would come. But now I have to be honest with you, the way this channel always tries to be. Because for all that ingenuity, all that knowledge, all that careful planning, sometimes it simply wasn't enough. There were times when the famine was too long. When the winter was too harsh, the drought too deep, the herds gone for too many seasons in a row. When the stored food ran out, and the bark and the roots, and the last desperate fallbacks couldn't fill enough bellies. And in those times, people starved. They died. This is not a story with a clean, triumphant ending where human cleverness always wins. The grim reality is that starvation was one of the great killers throughout human history, and we can still read it in the bones of the ancient dead. Periods of severe malnutrition leave permanent marks on the skeleton and the teeth, lines and defects that record, thousands of years later, the seasons a person nearly starved as a child. Our ancestors lived their entire lives in the shadow of possible hunger. The ingenuity was real, and it saved countless lives, but it was a defense against a relentless enemy, not a victory over it. They were not always winning, they were enduring. And yet, here we are, which means that on the whole, across the vast sweep of time, it worked. Enough people survived enough lean seasons using these humble, overlooked skills to carry the human line forward, unbroken, all the way down to you. And that's what I find genuinely moving about this whole story, because we celebrate the wrong things. We put the hunter on the wall, spear raised, in his moment of glory. But the people who really saved our species were, so often, the quiet ones. The woman who knew exactly which root to dig in the frozen earth. The elder who remembered how to leach the poison from the acorns because they'd seen it done in the last great famine decades before. The patient hands that smashed the bones for grease, that dried the fish, that stored the nuts against the coming cold. This was not glorious work. It earned no songs, but it is the reason we exist. Humanity survived not because we were the best hunters, but because we were the most resourceful eaters. The cleverest, most knowledgeable, most stubborn foragers the world has ever seen. We didn't conquer hunger with strength. We outsmarted it, one humble, desperate, brilliant meal at a time. So here's my last question for you. You live in a world of abundance our ancestors could not have dreamed of. Food on every shelf, in every season, available the moment you want it, requiring nothing of you but the walk to the kitchen. The deep knowledge they depended on, which root, which bark, which nut, how to make the poison safe, how to survive the empty winter, has almost completely vanished from our minds because we no longer need it. And maybe that's a kind of triumph, but it's also a kind of forgetting. So ask yourself this. If the shelves were suddenly empty and the easy food was gone, and you had to feed yourself from the bare landscape around you, the way every one of your ancestors once could, would you know how? And what does it mean that almost none of us, the heirs to all that hard-won survival, would last a single hungry winter on what our ancestors knew by heart? Let me know what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I'll see you soon.